Welcome back to the podcast and part 3 in our Pastor John and Janet Kuhlmann series. Parts 1 and 2 covered really the start of the revival movement here in Australia. And we left off part 2 with the great revival that happened in the late 1970s due to the counterculture revolution that was happening at the time. If you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2, then hit the pause button, go back and have a listen, and then jump onto this great episode, number 3. Enjoy. So, purchased the Vogue, it's mid-70s?
Yeah, 76.
Yeah. And so there was obviously a lot of revival happening at that point in time.
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, what really happened while we were still in Elizabeth East, we were getting a lot of contacts down in Adelaide and further south. We'd had a lot of revival already amongst the surfing community around Seaford and so on. But when God provided us with the Vogue, which was quite amazing how that all came together for us coming from Elizabeth East, which was not the top of the social scale as far as Adelaide suburbs were concerned, to Kingswood, which was up there. That was quite amazing, and I think quite distressing for some of the people in the neighbourhood to find these Elizabethans coming down to invade Adelaide. But because we're in a central location, there were people who came along who had not wanted to go all the way out to Elizabeth. So more of the surfy types and people from around Glenelg and all those sort of places that started to come in, including the Rogers family. And Tim is one of our pastors now. And so
he's up in...
He's in Wollongong.
Yeah, the East Coast, yeah.
Yep. So there was lots of that happening, but also about that time, Pastor Darrell Williams had moved, must have been just after we came to the Vogue, I think he moved to Dubbo, and he had quite a revival there. And there was a girl in the fellowship, and there was some of these druggy types were pretty wild, and they didn't worry much about things. And she picked up this young man who was hitchhiking, which normally you don't expect young ladies to pick up young men. And she brought him to Pastor Darrell in Dubbo, and he said, well, take him round to the boys' house. So this lad came to the Lord, and he was a heroin addict. Kim, I think his name was. And so he only just got baptised and Spirit-filled, and he decided to come back to Adelaide, that he'd come from originally. And he went out hitchhiking. And there was a chap by the name of Rod Connock who picked him up, and Rod's still in our fellowship now. But Rod offered him a joint when he got in the car, and Kim said, I don't do it anymore. He said, I used to, but I came to the Lord. So this brought Rod to the Lord. They came back, and Kim went around and spoke to a lot of people that he knew, and a lot of those people actually came to the Lord, even though, as far as I know, Kim didn't really go on with his walk in the Lord himself. There was a lot of people who did. And the chain included people like Pastor Steve Harvey, who came sort of indirectly as a result of him, Ben Robinson, and a chap called Mick Wordley, who brought a lot of people along. There was another girl called Vicky Angrave, who's now married to David Hillier. And this really was a real snowball effect. And we were in the Vogue Theatre by this time. And I can remember having a follow-up meeting in the downstairs foyer. And there was a lot of new people. And if I remember rightly, there was about 17 new people there that had come to the Lord in recent times. And they were nearly all, brand new converts. I remember our daughter, who was only about 15 at the time, she was there, and she was the only person there that was been brought up in the fellowship. All the rest of them were fairly raw converts. So that started a big revival, and most of our revival for one period there was amongst young people, and a lot of them finished up finding a partner and they got married, and some of them are now grandparents in the fellowship.
And pastors even.
That's right.
It's interesting. I mean, I was a little kid at that stage,
Yes.
and so I was sort of around at that time, but I don't remember, what people like Pastor Steve were like as they came to the Lord. And people who see him now,
Yes,
because of he's so vastly
He had a lot of
different. People looking at him now would say, "Oh, well, he's a pastor, and
Yes.
they are of a certain type." But they probably can't even imagine
no.
what he
Well,
must have been like.
the story was that somebody, I think a couple of our brothers, went to a place where he was, where there was a lot of them in sort of commune type living, and he sat there in the background and listened while the others were being witnessed to, and he was very interested because he'd been brought up to go to the Anglican church, and he knew there was nothing there. He used to sing in their choir because he can sing a bit, and he heard all of this, and he decided to come to a meeting. And I can recall that first meeting that he came to. He came out the front. I actually prayed for him, and he received the Holy Spirit. Now his hair, it's very red, and it was very curly, and it was very long, and it was really lying down on his shoulders and so on. And I prayed for him, and he received the Holy Spirit, and he got baptised. And I think it was a midweek meeting. And the next meeting I came to, I thought we had a new person there, but it was Steve with his haircut. He
was a new person.
He was a new person.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Changed from the inside out.
Yeah.
And fortunately, he was just one of those people who saw it straight away. And he thought, right, I've got a new chance here. And he was a drug addict. He was... he worked in the printing industry, done his apprenticeship there, and he was about to lose his job because he was so unreliable and didn't turn up for work and so on. I think the boss was going to sack him, but he was sort of getting around to it, and the next thing, next time he misses off, takes a day off without permission, he's out the door.
Wow.
Well, he's still there.
Yeah.
Maybe not the same firm. But that was a big change in his life, and a lot of others like him that came to the Lord.
Must have been a pretty amazing time for you to be a part of.
Part of it, yes.
And such a real change in culture and society at the time, which obviously...
Well, one of the amazing things about it was that culturally we'd come from a different world.
Yes.
And
Of course, both of you, yeah.
That's right. And there was one fellow, Aussie, he came along, and he was such a hippie that we almost needed an interpreter because I'd be talking Bible terms and he'd be using hippie terms. But we had a common interest. He wanted to know the truth and I wanted to tell him the truth. So we finished up being quite close. And I remember when he got married, he'd been living with this lady for some time, and it must have been even before we came to the Vogue.
Got married at our place in
house at Elizabeth, just before we came to the Vogue. But that was just part of a big group of people. Then there was the Mitcham Village group that came along, and there was a dear old sister that in our fellowship, she owned some houses there, the Tilley family. They owned quite a bit of land up the
Brown Hill Creek way.
Brown Hill Creek.
Yeah.
And she had these houses, and there was different ones that lived there, and a lot of those people came to the Lord. And huge changes in people's lives. And to see people that were drug addicts immediately delivered from their addiction. This Vicky that I mentioned before, she was a nurse, and she was addicted to heroin, but she was also helping herself to drugs at the hospital, which is a very dangerous thing for her and the patients and so on. But she came to the Lord and was just totally set free from her addiction.
And it was her testimony that Ben talks about that brought him to the Lord. And Ben's on an earlier episode of the podcast where he talks about that.
That's right.
One of the things that when you look at our fellowship today and you go to a centre where there's a few hundred people, if you understand and look at the backgrounds of all of the people that are there,
yes,
I can't imagine another place that you can find people with such diverse backgrounds, whether they're cultural backgrounds, philosophical backgrounds, you've got people who've been in prison, who've had heroin lifestyles, who've grown up in churches, these vast different people, but they're all there communing together with God in such a wonderful environment, all bonded by the Holy Spirit, and just all getting along so well. It's just it just doesn't happen in other.
That's what the Bible calls the unity of the Spirit.
Yeah.
In the bond of peace.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Praise the Lord.
I remember a young brother who came to the Lord a couple of years ago, and he'd see pastors on the stage or the guys on the stage, who are getting up and giving talks. And he would often say to me, he said, "Oh, but Ben, they don't understand me, or they don't understand what I've come through because I've, had this tough background, or I've come from, a life of drugs and despair." And I go, "But that pastor up there had exactly the same scenario. So let's go and talk to him about his background." Or, that guy, Ben, who's given a talk this afternoon, his background was just as bad as yours.
Yes.
And that vast difference between this new guy that was just starting to come along and these people that, had been filled with the Spirit and let God change their lives, so dramatically.
At one stage, we had a senior police officer. He was very high up in the South Australian Police Force. And he came, I think, to the play, and he had a couple of people giving their testimony. And he said, "I spent my life trying to lock up people like that." Yes, and he came to the Lord himself.
Yeah, imagine. And so now we've got, I think you said that there was a hall purchased at Elizabeth again later on?
Yes, we got the Vogue in 1976, and we had such a huge revival that we used to look at how many people were taking communion. There was more than that because not everyone got there at once. We had about 300 people at a communion service at Elizabeth, and we'd packed out the hall we had there. And in 5 years, it had grown to 800. And the Vogue Theatre was absolutely packed out. So what are we going to do? And so we decided to look at getting a meeting at Elizabeth, and we managed to buy. That was quite miraculous, really, when you talk about how God provides for his people. And the economy was down, and particularly in Elizabeth. And the Anglican Church were selling off a number of their properties. I don't think they needed many. Most people had woken up to the Church of England, they didn't have much to offer. And they had a place at Elizabeth Vale, which was on a nice piece of land, and it had an acre of ground, and it had a hall on it, their church. And we managed to buy this, and we got it, I think, for $50,000, which was... The land alone was worth that, and so we had a building there, and we built a Sunday school alongside, and we started that up, and we were having revival there. I remember the first day we went up to Elizabeth for the first meeting, and I rang up the Vogue, and I said, and Pastor Steve answered the phone, cheeky fellow, and I said, just ring up to let you know that we had a baptism at Elizabeth. He said, that's interesting. We just had 7 at the Vogue. And so it just continued to grow at both places. And the Vogue over the next few years grew, and the 200 people that had gone to Elizabeth, we were filling that space up. So we started having meetings down south. To the Moana Primary School, and we were having revival at all our 3 centres then, and so it just continued to grow.
And eventually we
built a hall down at Woodcroft
Right,
to take over that. And
Yeah.
now we've got these 3 great centres. In fact, 4th when
That's
you
right.
include Gawler,
Yes,
that
that's
covers
right,
the Adelaide area.
Not to mention the camp.
Of
Yes.
course, the camp.
Yes, well, the camp. Okay. Do you want to get onto that?
Let's talk about the camp, because that
Okay.
is, for a youngster that grew up down at that camp.
Yes.
I go down there today and just realise what an amazing
there was-
blessing it is for us to spend time down there.
There was a pastor that used to come across from Victoria, and he used to talk about the Adelaide secret weapon called Carrickalinga. And it was, what had happened going back a few years, the Canberra Assembly had been having Easter camps at a place called Sturt Creek up on the Murrumbidgee, Sturt Island, I think it was called. And I'd never been to it, but I'd heard about it. So we decided that we would hire a camp at Clarendon, and we were having Easter camps there, which people loved. And we started also having Christmas camps at Victor Harbour in the Valley caravan park there, and, taking a tent down and all that sort of thing.
We had meetings in a hall.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And but one day at the Clarendon Easter camp, on the Monday we were cleaning up, and I walked in, the men were in there doing a final clean-up of the ablution block, and they were tradesmen. And they, and I remember David Patterson and Brian Allen were amongst them, and one was a plumber and the other was a ceramic tiler, and I forget who the other 2 were, but they said, we've been talking, as people do, and they said, let's get our own camp. And I said, well, what are we going to do for money? And they said, that's your job to organise that. But you find the camp and we'll do the work. So I remembered that.
Yeah.
I kept them to it. 40-odd years later, they're
We
still
used
at
to
it.
spend our Saturdays going around looking for some land
That's
with the
right.
kids. Yeah.
So we started looking, and eventually we found this place. I went to Victor Harbour, and I said to the young real estate fellow there, I said, look, we're looking for a campsite. I know just the place for you, he said. And where's that? He said, it's at Carrickalinga. And he thought of it because he knew this land, the Fork Tree Station, which had been, I think 2,000 acres or something or other, had been subdivided into 80-acre allotments. And the one that we now have was, for various reasons, was a bit smaller than that. It was about 50 acres. But it was right on the Carrickalinga Creek. And he knew that there were people that used to come there and have a bush camp
Okay.
at this spot with the consent of the owner. And so when it sort of camped, you could camp there. So we went down and had a look at it and fell in love with the place. But there was a problem. They wanted money for it. So we decided to arrange with the agent, we would go and have a look. And we used to have our meetings at Elizabeth in the afternoon and evening, 3 o'clock. So we got up early, and I took a carload down. There was 6 of us went down, and we had various tradesmen, and we had Dean Clee, who was an accountant, and we had a look at this place, and of course it was just ideal. So we went across to Victor Harbour and we said we'd like to put in an offer on it. As it so happened that this was the first sale of this whole subdivision. They were very keen to get a sale. So we made an offer on it, and they wanted $33,000, I think it was. So would you accept 30,000? Maybe I can put it to. And they said, but we need 10% deposit. Now, I knew we didn't have that much in the bank. I said, what about 5%? That's a bit irregular, but I'll put it to the vendor. So they put it to them and they accepted. But then we had to raise the finance, and it happened that there was a brother who'd sold a business and he had some money and he was prepared to lend it to us, because in those days the bank would not lend you money on bare land.
Right.
You had to have a building on it. So we then decided that we would go ahead. We were able to purchase it with money borrowed from this brother, and we set about to build the ablution block.
And for those that don't know what an ablution block is, it's a toilet block.
A toilet
with
block.
some showers.
Yeah, that's right.
I was
showers
explaining to someone the other day that I'd gone down to a camp to do a bit of some work on the ablution block, and he said, "What's an ablution block?" I said,
It's got water in it.
I can explain to you what ablutions were, but maybe I'll just tell you it's a toilet and a shower block.
Yes, okay. So that's what we got, and of course that was a building. So then our bank was prepared to lend us the money, and we were able to pay the brother back. So that was the start of it at Carrickalinga, and that was before we got the Vogue. That was late 74 when we got onto that, and during 1975 we had working bees, and practically every Saturday I would go down from Elizabeth. We had a big old trailer which Pastor Jock had got made up for us to have for outreaches, but it was very handy for carting materials down. I'd spend a Friday getting the material together, and on Saturday morning there was nowhere to stay down there. So Saturday morning, get up at daybreak, grab a team of guys, we'd all go down there.
It's a fair old drive. It'd be a good couple of hours, wouldn't it, from Elizabeth?
That's from Elizabeth.
Yes.
And of course I had a young son, and he would have been about 10 years old. And he used to come down too, and of course playing in the creek and so on. But whereas a lot of people found it hard to find things to do with their son when they're busy, I didn't find it hard. And he'd come home filthy from playing in the creek, but happy 100%.
What boys should do at that
That's
age.
right.
Absolutely.
And the early stages of the camp was built entirely by voluntary labour, and we put up the ablution block, the shower block, and everything. But it was also rather interesting because when we first came across this place, we had to go to the council to get their permission to do it, and they gave us permission. And so we immediately put in plans to put on the ablution block, and straight after Christmas we'd had them approved, and we set to work, and we had several truckloads of concrete come in to put down the foundations. And when the neighbours saw all this happening, what's going on? So they found out what we were up to. They went to the council, they objected to what we were doing, but the council had already approved it. I can remember being in the council office with the town clerk and the chairman of the council, and they said, "Oh, would you stop your building because people aren't happy with it?" And I said, "But the bricks are on their way down." I said, "They could come past the council office here any minute now." And they persuaded me to ring up Darrell and say, "Could you just hold the bricks until later?" So I said, "Okay, we've got them to hold it." I went to the local member of parliament in Elizabeth, who helped us before about a few things, and he said, "My advice to you is to get those bricks in there as soon as you can." Because the further you get with it, the more difficult it'll be for the council to stop you.
Yeah, right.
So I'd promised I wouldn't bring truckloads down there, but I didn't promise that we wouldn't bring them in by trailer from the other way.
from the other entrance, not through the council town.
That's right, yeah. So we had them deposited at a brother's place at Port Noarlunga, and we came with a string of trailers and carted the bricks down to there, and so I sort of kept my promise there. And of course we got it up, and then we had huge opposition. They really went to work on us. They contacted government people, Ministry of Local Government, the Health Department, the Premier's office, and all this sort of thing. And that's when I thought, now, they're going to all of these people. we were in a Labor stronghold. It was a Labor government. So I went to the local member, who was the lawyer, and anyway, he rang up his colleague in the health department and so on. But more than that, they decided to get the local member of parliament, who happened to be on the other side of politics.
What was his name?
Ted Chapman. His daughter is now Deputy Premier. And he was invited to a meeting, and there had been a meeting of them there, and we even came on television where I think Channel 7 or Channel 10, I forget which one it was, came down and saw what we were doing, and they recorded this meeting, and the headlines in the news that night was that local residents in Carrickalinga band together to form Progress Association to stop progress. So we realised that we had the TV people on our side.
Yeah.
And we were in the same camp with the council, who were sort of annoyed that they got themselves into this position because they had legally agreed for us to do it.
Yeah.
But Ted Chapman went to this meeting.
Wasn't it a protest meeting of the local
That's
people?
right, yeah, and that lived there. But of course, they were wealthy people, judges and lawyers and surgeons and all sorts of people. And Ted was a shearer, and so he didn't have a lot of time for these sort of high flyers. So in the report that he made, which was scathing in his criticism of them, he kept referring to them as the Shack Owners Committee.
And for those that don't understand, so Carrickalinga is about an hour or so south of Adelaide.
That's
a
right.
little seaside community.
That's right.
With lots of fancy houses for people,
right.
and that was their
Yes.
sort of weekend residence.
That's
Yes,
right.
that's right.
The shack owners. They would have been terribly offended at that.
That's right. And so he really came out on our side. And so anyway, we finished up being able to go ahead, and then we built an ablution block. During that year, 1975, we built the ablution block. We put up a shed. We put in some gravel roads. We laid out the electricity. The electricity people were very good to us. They came in and put the supply in, and it was a lot cheaper to get it those days than it is now. And so it just grew from there.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that whole protest is that you can't even see it from the road.
Yes.
Right? There's a little road that drives into it, and then it opens up into this great property. So there's no visible impact on the local residents.
Yes.
Really, the only impact is a positive one on the local community when, 2000 was conversion Christmas time down
Oh,
on the local
like
shop
us.
people, etc. So it is fascinating that there's such opposition.
One thing, of course, we're quite evangelical, and when we take some people down to the beach to baptise them, it gathers a crowd.
It does.
And some of the elite of the society are having to sit there and watch from their balconies while we're happily singing choruses on the beach. But they need saving too.
Exactly, they do.
Interestingly, one of the couples that were down there, I think they were actually living there, and they were ones that were objecting to it. And at the time, being quite magnanimous as I am, I said, well, look, the Bible says return good for evil, so we'll return them a favour, we'll convert their kids. And lo and behold, shortly after this, there was a young couple who'd been living together, came to the Lord. And she was the daughter of one of these couples that lived down there.
Yeah, right.
And I think it was the first marriage I performed at the Vogue Theatre.
Yeah, okay.
But anyway, they've forgiven us, I think, because the daughter's done well.
And it's been, such a wonderful blessing. So many amazing camps,
Yeah,
from
people-
kids to teens to youngies
kids.
camps to over 50s camps to Christmas and Easters and zones, etc. So
It's
many,
well used.
and so many people have come to the Lord there.
That's
Yes.
right.
Have been baptised there, have been filled with the Spirit there. In
Yes.
fact, I think your son-in-law the testimony of that camp was very powerful for him in
Yes.
terms of him coming to the Lord. So it is just such a delightful place and such a wonderful blessing for our
Yes.
fellowship.
Have you got his?
Yeah, he was earlier on in the
Okay.
series, so
Yes.
he's told his story to us before, which is great. So for those that are listening that haven't heard his story, go back and listen to Pastor Chris's story about how his life was transformed. I think my headline title for it is "Transformed from Druggie to Pastor."
Yes. Okay. Yes.
That's right.
So we spent a fair bit of time talking about the foundation of the Adelaide Fellowship. But out of the Adelaide Fellowship came a lot of other fellowships across the world, and you've been involved both, for people going from here to overseas.
Yes.
But also, I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your brother from another mother,
Yes.
Pastor Godfrey, and about your perspective on PNG.
Yes.
It'd be great to talk about that too. So,
Yeah.
but there's been a lot of expansion overseas from
Yes.
that sort of come out of people from Adelaide,
I think
hasn't
about
there?
Peter Visser in
Yes.
Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he came to the Lord.
Yes.
in-
Yeah, well, Peter's story, he's born in Holland. He and his wife Nettie, they got married in Holland. They moved to Adelaide with their 2 young boys. And in the process of time, they got spoken to. Now, Peter was brought up to go to the Orthodox, not Orthodox, Dutch, Reformed, Dutch Reformed.
Yeah.
And he didn't buy it. He'd been in the army, the Dutch army, and he was pretty cynical about religion. And somebody witnessed to him, and he brought him along to a meeting, and he tells the story that I got up to preach this day, and I said, my opening line was, I don't believe that Adam was the first man. And that got his attention, because he didn't believe, he couldn't see how that, as some fundamentalist believers do, that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And so I explained how that in the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible, the opening chapter talks about how that God created male and female and so on. And then in chapter 2, he talks about how that Adam was formed out of the dust of the ground. Now, some have assumed that this is talking about the same people. But our teaching is, and it made sense to me as well when I heard it.
And that's how the scriptures read.
Yes, that there were people living there long before Adam. And so that got his interest, and so we were able to go on from there and to show the salvation message in the New Testament, how that you to repent and be baptised by full immersion, receive the Spirit, and you'll speak in tongues. And that happened to him. And his wife had serious heart troubles, and she got a healing from that. Anyway, they came along happily, brought a few other people themselves, including their boys, and one of them is with them in Holland now, and is actually a pastor in the work over there.
Pastor
Another Ben.
Benny, I think.
Another Ben.
Yeah. Ben. Yeah.
So they're pretty good, some of these Bens. And so Peter and Nettie, after several years, decided to go back to Holland and visit some of their relatives, and they witnessed to them, and they brought some of them to the Lord, including a nephew, Harry, who, there was a brother and a sister-in-law and a couple of sisters and their husbands, and that I think that was the story. And one of the nephews, is Harry, was in the Navy, the Dutch Navy, and he was a place called Den Helder, I think, which is up to the north of the country, which is a naval base. And he got in there and started talking to the guys there, and a number of the Navy personnel came to the Lord, and still going on to the Lord, some of them as well. So that started a revival there. So Peter and Nettie came back, and they said, well, what are we going to do with these people? We can't just leave them over there. And they the head of another group that sounded a bit similar to us, and Peter checked that out and he said, no, it's not the same. And it turned out to be a good thinking, because they turned out to be worse than they looked on the surface. So Peter and Nettie came back, sold up, and went back there, and they virtually had nothing when they went over to Holland. And Peter's a very industrious sort of fellow.
And that would have been an easy thing because he had a business here as well.
That's right. Yeah.
He was a boat builder.
Yeah.
Down the port.
Yeah.
Yes. So they got back to Holland, to Dordrecht, which is an island in the middle of the river there, whatever it's called there, and near Rotterdam, just across the way from Rotterdam, which is one of the big cities in Europe, huge port there, the mouth of the Rhine. So they witnessed around there, and today they've got 3 centres in Holland, and Peter is sort of supervising work in other places, Germany, Switzerland, France, Hungary, Czech Republic, and it's spreading out from there and so on, and also sort of assisting with the work across the Channel in England.
We've had a couple of people on the podcast. We had Stefan Juscher from Switzerland as well,
and another Ben,
and another Ben, and we've had Pastor Chris and Monica as well from Hungary. So that was good fun too. So, and what about in the UK? So did that come out of Pastor Peter?
No,
there, or is that different?
They were there before. There was a couple from Victoria that went over to talk to, because they got married in Australia, and they went back, and the husband was from Liverpool, and he spoke to a fellow he knew by the name of Bob Jones, and he came to the Lord, and so we had a little, and Bob became the pastor there, and he came to Australia because back in those days, we were in the Vogue by this time, and he came to visit us, and an interesting fellow, amazing sense of humour some of these people have from Liverpool. And I remember him telling the story when he came here about the docker, as they call them, and they were, this fellow was there on the wharf, and he had the RSPCA inspector tapped him on the shoulder, and he said, I've had a complaint against you. And he said, why is that? He said, you kicked that snail into the water. And he said, so? He said, well, what have you got against snails? He said, well, nothing in general, but this one in particular. Said, well, what has he done? He said, he's been following me around all day. So that was fairly typical of Bob.
What the dockers were like too. They didn't hurry about their work. Yeah. He was a warper, in other words. Yeah.
Yes. So, but anyway, Bob had a little group there, and it started from there. But as others went over, we had a family that went from Adelaide to London and started the North London Assembly, and our daughter and son-in-law, Chris and Christine, they were not, he wasn't a pastor at the time, in fact they'd only been married about a year, and they decided to move over there and help. It might have been a bit more than a year, but anyway, this fellow came along and married our daughter and took her all the way over to England. But we forgave him, because when they came back 7 years later, we had 3 grandchildren. So that was good.
Oh, the English accent.
And they have great grandchildren too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They lost the English accents very quickly out here. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Chris and Chris were determined not to lose their Aussie accent. So. Yeah, so that was a big thing in the English work, and the North London Assembly is still going strong, and Chris and Chris had quite a big impact on that as well for the 7 years that they were there. But also from here, other places, Cairns, Neil Jenner went from here to Cairns and started an assembly up there. Jock, who's back here now, he'd been a pastor, he'd been my assistant for years, and he went to Christchurch, started an assembly there, which is still going. We have In fact, we've got a few assemblies around New Zealand, and most of the pastors are actually Aussies. Brian Smith in New Plymouth, he's the exception. He's a true Kiwi. But Sasha, Pastor Laurie's son-in-law, he did actually come to the Lord in Christchurch, so he's a Kiwi as well. We had him here for a few years, but he's still barracks for the All Blacks, whatever they are. I think they play some funny sort of football, just not our real code here. And Laurie Nankerville was running the assembly in Te and he's handed over to Alan Butler, who is very English, but he actually came to the Lord in Whyalla. Which is another interesting story.
Whyalla had a bit of an amazing revival there for a while. Right. So you've got Pastor Laurie, Pastor Alan. I interviewed Pastor Michael in Canberra and Liz, and he came.
Till.
He came to the Lord.
Roland Rocky.
Pastor Roland from Melbourne.
Yes, well, the story with Whyalla, we tried several times to get a fellowship going there, being near to Adelaide and one of the bigger cities outside of Adelaide, not that they're all that big. We didn't seem to get anywhere much until Roland Rocky came to the Lord. He was actually at Rapid Bay, which is south of Adelaide, not far from our campsite.
That's right.
And he was working for BHP. And there was another brother, Ian Matthews, and he was from New South Wales, but he was, even though he was an accountant, he was a hippie, and so he didn't want to do accounting. He was picking grapes or something rather up in the Barossa Valley here in South Australia. And there was an outreach that we had, must have been in the late 70s, I think, and I was away, and Pastor Jock led an outreach in the Barossa Valley. And they were campaigning in the caravan park and around the place, and they had some converts. And there was an interesting story of this guy that was going to get baptised, but he had a penny farthing, which is an old-fashioned push bike with a great big wheel at the front and so on. And so he led them around to various places where he could get baptised. It was Anzac weekend, I think. And they couldn't find a suitable place, including going into a farmer's property, which was a German farmer, a good Lutheran. And I think one of them worked there, but he knew, I knew with this dam, so they went there, but the Lutheran farmer booted them off because they'd been there without permission, but they had a convoy of cars following them everywhere. They eventually found a place down by the riverside in a waterhole there, and there was a couple there having a nice quiet picnic, and all of these people turned up like ants at a picnic. And they finished up baptising a couple of people. But one of them was a guy called Tim Hutton, who is still in our fellowship, and he's just married off all his 3 kids, happily married.
Yeah.
And Tim had come down from New South Wales, and after he came to the Lord, we were at our camp at Carrickalinga, and he decided to go and see Ian Matthews that he'd met up there as well. And Ian came to the Lord, and his wife had just had their first child, and the baby was 6 days old, and we baptised them at Carrickalinga Beach, and Janet sat in their ute nursing their baby while they got baptised in the sea.
Yeah.
We brought them back to the ablution block, the shower block, where they both received the Holy Spirit. Now, Ian went back to Rapid Bay and he witnessed to Roland Rocky, right, who'd been brought up as a Catholic. And
Good Italian.
Oh, yes, yes. And his wife was of German extraction, but she was also a Catholic. And they both came to the Lord, and it's quite a story in itself. And so shortly after this, BHP sold their interests in Rapid Bay. but because they were both Ian and Roland were employed by the BHP. I think Ian was just a gardener or something, but they were offered positions anywhere that they wanted to go in Australia with BHP. And to BHP's surprise, they both said, Whyalla, because Roland had been witnessing to his family up there, and they were coming to the Lord.
Wow.
So they moved up there, and so at the time they didn't have a pastor. We were sending people up, and Laurie Nankerville, who was a school teacher, and he came to me and he said, I've been told that I have to do some country service. Would it help if I went to Whyalla? I said it surely would. So he'd been a house leader here, so he became the pastor in Whyalla.
So he's another one of these hippie converts too, wasn't he?
Yes, that's another story. Well, he had been, I don't know whether we're stealing his thunder. Have you got his story?
No, I haven't yet, but we can talk about it when he's not here.
I'll give you my version. It might vary. But he was a school teacher, and he worked down at Taparoo, and he was a progressive type of school teacher in his mind. But I don't know whether the department were all that thrilled with him. But he had a Volkswagen, and he'd had it, as the kids had painted it, whatever they liked, and he'd written on it as well, Jimi Hendrix, that's all there is. And so he pulled up in his Volkswagen at the lights, and one of our young fellows was riding a push bike, came up, and he poked his head in the window and he said, so you think Jimi Hendrix is pretty good, do you? He said, yeah, I do. He said, have you ever tried Jesus Christ? And Laurie said, I want to talk to you.
I'm not sure about you, but I'm really enjoying listening to these wonderful stories from Pastor John and Janet, even though I was there in 2018 when we originally recorded the interviews. If you're enjoying them as well, then share it with somebody, or make a comment or rate us on your favourite podcast app so that others can come to know what God is doing in people's lives today. Until next time, God bless.